So we'll be looking at a temple site that was started by the Chandelas, and they were rulers of a small kingdom in North India with a capital at Khajuraho, which was another UNESCO World Heritage Site, UNESCO being the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. So these rulers built a temple for every year that they were in power, which totals to about 85 temples. And the majority were erected in the 10th and 11th century. And it's not unusual to see this many building structures on the same site, but the enormity of this site, which was like an entire square mile, suggests that there could have been an alternative motive. So perhaps it's to declare power or to make it a seat of religious leadership. And so this temple is the Kandariya Mahadeva temple. And this was at the climax of building activity in the 11th century. And the Kandaraya Mahadeva temple rises about 98 feet high. It has one entrance, which is an assembly hall, and that's called a mandapa, and then a vestibule before the main shrine called a garbhagriha. And then it's surrounded by a processional passage for circumambulation. Only the Brahmins are allowed to enter into the inner sanctum, which is called the Garbhagriha. And therefore, the mandapa, the kind of entryway, is the place where devotees could gather while they were waiting for the Brahmin to perform their rituals. Ritual worship is called a puja, and Brahmins performed pujas at set times of day. They were also performed those for individual worshippers because an essential part of the puja for the devotees to make a connection with the divine, and the Brahmins were priests who could assist with that. So the elevation of I'm having trouble with my slides. Hang on a second. So the elevation of the Kandariya Mahadeva temple has three horizontal zones. The first zone is a solid basement, which raises the floor level of the temple to about 13 feet above ground. And the second zone has a series of walls and interim compartments, and there's a series of projections and recesses that allow for maximum number of these sculpted images. Here, three horizontal sculpted bands hold about 650 life-size figures in total. And they're carved in a high relief. The elevation culminates in a grouping of roofs reminiscent of a mountain range that sweeps upward toward the tall shikara above the shrine. And the shikara symbolizes the cosmic mountain of the universe. So this temple's famous exterior sculptures have this iconographic program that's yet to be thoroughly studied. So because texts for temple decoration during this time specified that images of women were a necessity, there were more female mortal figures than gods. In fact, a lot of these images of women have often been used as auspicious emblems through the history of Indian art. Here they're depicted as nude to the waist with large breasts and small waists and big hips and heavy thighs, and wearing lots of jewelry. In general, these types of women represent the potential for fertility in both the spiritual and the physical sense. So these carvings are done in high relief. They also depict both the Mithuna and Maithuna couples, which represent the unity and duality of male and female energies. So Maithuna couples are explicitly shown engaged in sexual intercourse. And these images are placed on the joining wall that connects the sanctum and the assembly hall. So texts describe this shrine in the hall as the bridegroom and the bride with the joining wall as their place of union. So it's like a pun, basically. On joining or copulating or coming together in sexual unity. So the Chandelas were patrons of a esoteric sect that practiced tantric Hinduism. Part of what's shown on these sculptures is a tantric act of partaking in activities that would ordinarily be prohibited, and that's called of Panchamakara, which is also known as the five Mas. So each syllable of the word begins with Ma. There's Matsya, fish, Mamsa, meat, Mudra, which is a parched grain beverage like beer, and then Mada, like wine, and Matsuna, the sexual intercourse. Normally, these things would be considered highly addictive, but the goal of Tantra is that if you partake in them, you would be able to overcome them and achieve enlightenment. So, this wall part of the temple is representing that Maituna sexual intercourse portion of this tantric sense of needing to overcome what you're not really allowed to partake in. And this is the great relief at Mamallapuram. It's also been called the Great Sculpted Cliff, or the Descent of Ganges, or Arjuna's Penance. But no one really knows what the iconography means. The relief dates from around the early to mid 600 years Common Era, and it's carved out of two. And it's carved out of two granite monoliths with a natural cleft in the center. The boulders measure 49 by 98 feet, so it's really big. And it incorporates a sense, it's incorporating a scene of a massive dwelling. And it has elephants at its base and Shiva, who's depicted twice on the relief. Once at the top and once below in a shrine. It's kind of hard to see. But it's believed that these reliefs depict one of these two stories about Shiva. So one story is in the Mahabharata, which is a great Indian epic, where Arjuna enacts a penance for Shiva's weapon. Or it's in the Bhargiratha, which performs an austerities to persuade Shiva to bear the force of the Ganges' descent to earth. So if the Ganges fell from the heaven to the earth without a buffer, it would have destroyed the world. The relief could possibly depict both of these stories, but most accept the interpretation that it depicts the descent of the Ganges. This site at Mamallapuram is far from the Ganges River. So by creating this relief, the Palaya rulers brought the Ganges to their territory. So the snake deities, take a closer look. You can see these snake deities down here in the natural cleft. And these snake deities that are kind of resting in this natural cleft suggest that there's a water theme in this relief. There's also an unfinished carving about the same subject found pretty nearby, but it was likely abandoned because of the quality of the granite being very difficult to carve into and maintain the shapes. And then we start to see during the Chola dynasty the production of these portable metal images of deities. It was an important practice for them. They were they used a copper alloy with a small amount of lead, tin, gold, and silver. And the combination was believed to have had magical properties. So these objects were bathed, clothed, decorated with flowers, and then kept in separate shrines and temples. Some temples, such as the Rajarajeshvara temple, built by Raja Raja Chola I in the 11th century, possessed 66 metal sculptures according to the inscriptions. These metal images were used during festival processions, or they could be taken out of the temple grounds and attached to these carts called rathas. And then these carts could be taken to these devotional festivals, and it would bring the divine to the devotee, so that they would really have no reason not to find this connection to the divine. This sculpture that we're looking at is the Shiva Nataraja, and it was the supreme Chola image. So there were dozens of it in existence, and it had an image that has its religious and political connotation. The object shows Shiva dancing the destruction of our era. And Shiva, because she's the god of contradictions, the universe is also being created at the same time. So Shiva could perhaps be a political emblem of the Cholas, signifying their power to create or destroy their subjects. The metal images were constructed using a cire perdu, or lost wax technique, and initially the image was carved out of wax. Then the wax was encased in clay, and then the clay gets fired. While it's being fired, the wax melts away and runs out of the passageways, and that leaves a clay mold. And then molten metal is poured into that clay mold. And then once that's cool, the mold is broken, and the image remains with all of its detail. So this system was also used and kind of revived during the Renaissance by Donatello when he made the David. If you can remember that small statue of the naked David who's also wearing boots and has a hat during the Renaissance. And that concludes our study of Hindu sculpture and architecture. There's obviously a lot more that comes later. But yeah, Hinduism kind of takes over where Buddhism is, but they've kind of overlapped on each other, and you can see that if you take any religious history class. But I hope that was a good introduction to the kind of iconography of Hinduism.